The morning mist hung low over the palace grounds as Sergeant James Morrison adjusted his red ceremonial jacket for what he didn't know would be the last time. 23 years he had served the crown, standing guard through countless royal events, state dinners, and family gatherings. His boots clicked against the marble floors of Clarence House as he made his usual rounds, checking security points and briefing the younger guards. James had seen 3 generations of royals come and go. He remembered when Diana would sneak extra biscuits to the guards during long ceremonies, her warm smile lighting up even the most formal occasions. He had watched her sons grow from mischievous boys into men, and he had witnessed the family's darkest days when the people's princess was laid to rest. The palace was buzzing with preparations for Queen Camilla's birthday celebration that evening. Staff members hurried through hallways carrying flower arrangements, caterers wheeled in elaborate desserts, and security teams conducted final sweeps of the venue. James had been assigned to oversee the guest entrance, a position of trust that reflected his years of faithful service. As the afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows, James noticed unusual activity in the private quarters. Laura Lopez, Camilla's daughter from her first marriage, had arrived earlier than expected. She moved through the corridors with an air of confidence that came from growing up connected to royalty, though she had always maintained a relatively private life compared to her stepbrothers William and Harry. Laura had always been polite to the staff, but there was something different about her demeanor today. She carried herself with an unusual sense of entitlement, as if she belonged in spaces that had traditionally been reserved for blood royals. James watched from his post as she disappeared into the Queen's private chambers, thinking nothing of it at first. The palace's jewelry vault was a fortress within a fortress, protected by multiple layers of security and accessible only to a select few. But family members, especially those with Camilla's personal approval, often had more freedom than the strict protocol suggested. Laura had spent enough time in the palace to know its rhythms, its blind spots, and its unwritten rules. Hours passed as James continued his duties, greeting early arriving guests and coordinating with other security personnel. The birthday celebration was shaping up to be a grand affair, with members of Parliament, foreign dignitaries, and close family friends all expected to attend. The Queen herself was in high spirits, having spent the afternoon in preparation with her personal styling team. As evening approached, James took his position at the main entrance of the ballroom. The space was magnificent, with crystal chandeliers casting dancing lights across silk-covered walls and tables laden with the finest china. Everything was perfect, or so it seemed. The first guests began arriving at 7 o'clock sharp. James recognized many faces from previous events, cabinet ministers, longtime family friends, and various members of the extended royal circle. Each guest was announced formally as they entered, their names echoing through the grand space. When Laura Lopez was announced, James looked up from his position near the doorway. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. Around her neck was a stunning sapphire and diamond necklace, its deep blue stones catching the light with an unmistakable brilliance. But it wasn't just any necklace. It was one of the most famous pieces in the royal collection. The necklace had been a wedding gift to Princess Diana from the Queen Mother, featuring a magnificent Ceylon sapphire surrounded by diamonds. Diana had worn it to numerous state functions, and photographs of her in the piece had appeared on front pages around the world. It was more than jewelry. It was a symbol of Diana's place in royal history. James felt his pulse quicken. He had seen Diana wear that necklace dozens of times during his early years of service. He remembered how she would unconsciously touch it during formal photographs, how it would catch the camera flashes at state dinners, how it had become almost synonymous with her public image. The necklace was supposed to be held in trust, along with other pieces from Diana's collection, for the eventual use of Catherine and other future queens. But here was Laura, Diana's stepdaughter through marriage, wearing one of the late princess's most recognizable pieces to her mother's birthday party. The sight struck James as profoundly wrong, not just from a protocol standpoint, but on a deeper, more emotional level. It felt like a violation of Diana's memory and legacy. James tried to convince himself that perhaps there was an explanation. Maybe Camilla had given permission. Maybe it was part of some family agreement he wasn't aware of. Maybe he was mistaken about the necklace's identity. But as Laura moved through the crowd, the sapphires catching the light with each turn of her head, he became more and more certain of what he was seeing. The evening progressed with typical royal pageantry. Speeches were made, toasts were raised, and elegant conversations flowed throughout the ballroom. But James found it increasingly difficult to focus on his duties. His eyes kept returning to the necklace, each glimpse reinforcing his conviction that something was terribly amiss. During a brief, quiet moment, James approached his supervisor, Captain Reynolds, a man he had known and trusted for over a decade. Speaking in the low, measured tones that palace staff used for sensitive matters, James shared his observation about the necklace. Captain Reynolds initially dismissed the concern. Royal jewelry was complicated, he explained, with pieces often moving between different collections and family members. Perhaps this was all above board. Perhaps James was being overly cautious. But when James insisted on the specific identification of the piece and its significance, Reynolds agreed to make some discreet inquiries. What they discovered sent shockwaves through the security team. The necklace had indeed been taken from the collection designated for Diana's legacy, without proper authorization. There were no records of Camilla giving permission for its use, no documentation of any family agreement, and no protocol that would justify Laura wearing such a significant piece to a private family celebration. The realization hit the security team like a physical blow. They were witnessing, in real time, what appeared to be the unauthorized use of one of the most precious pieces in royal history. The necklace wasn't just valuable in monetary terms. It represented the memory of a beloved princess whose tragic death had shaken the monarchy to its core. James felt a mixture of anger and profound sadness wash over him. He had served the royal family with unwavering loyalty, had protected their secrets, had stood guard over their most private moments. He had been present for Diana's funeral, had seen the grief on her sons' faces, had witnessed the nation's mourning for their lost princess. And now he was watching as her memory was being casually disregarded. The question facing James and his colleagues was what to do with this information. Confronting Laura directly would create a scene that could destroy the Queen's birthday celebration and potentially cause lasting damage to family relationships. But allowing the evening to continue meant being complicit in what appeared to be a serious breach of royal protocol and a violation of Diana's legacy. As the party reached its peak, with laughter and conversation filling the elegant space, James made a decision that would change everything. He requested an immediate private meeting with Captain Reynolds and the head of palace communications. The time for discretion had passed. The situation demanded action, regardless of the consequences. The three men gathered in a small antechamber just off the main ballroom, the sounds of celebration filtering through the heavy doors. James laid out what he had observed, providing specific details about the necklace and its significance. He explained why he was certain of its identity and why its unauthorized use represented such a serious problem. Captain Reynolds, initially skeptical, found himself convinced by James's detailed knowledge and obvious sincerity. The communications director, a seasoned professional who had navigated numerous royal crises, immediately grasped the potential implications. If word of this situation leaked to the press, it could create a scandal that would overshadow not just the birthday celebration, but potentially damage the monarchy's carefully rebuilt reputation. They were facing an impossible choice. Taking immediate action would disrupt the celebration and likely create lasting family tensions. But doing nothing meant allowing what appeared to be a significant transgression to continue, potentially setting a dangerous precedent for the handling of Diana's legacy. As they debated their options in hushed, urgent tones, the celebration continued just beyond the door. Queen Camilla was holding court near the main table, surrounded by well-wishers and longtime friends. Laura moved through the crowd with easy confidence, the disputed necklace glinting under the chandeliers, apparently unaware that her choice of jewelry had sparked a crisis among the palace staff. The evening was about to take a turn that no one could have predicted, and James Morrison found himself at the center of a brewing storm that would test his loyalty, his principles, and his commitment to protecting the royal family. Even when that meant protecting them from themselves, the decision came swiftly and with devastating consequences. Captain Reynolds, after consulting with the palace's senior staff, determined that the situation required immediate intervention. The unauthorized wearing of Diana's necklace could not be allowed to continue, regardless of the embarrassment it might cause. James was chosen to approach Laura discreetly during a quiet moment in the celebration. His instructions were clear: request that she remove the necklace immediately and return it to the secure collection. The conversation was to be handled with the utmost diplomacy, but the outcome was non-negotiable. As James made his way through the crowd toward Laura, his heart pounded with the weight of what he was about to do. 23 years of service had taught him to navigate delicate situations, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. He was about to confront a member of the royal family during her mother's birthday celebration over what many would consider a family matter. Laura was standing near the dessert table, engaged in animated conversation with several family friends when James approached. He waited for a natural break in the discussion before quietly requesting a private word. The smile on Laura's face faltered slightly as she registered the serious expression on the guard's face, but she followed him to a secluded corner of the ballroom. Speaking in the measured, respectful tones that palace protocol demanded, James explained the situation. The necklace she was wearing, he informed her, was part of Diana's protected collection and required special authorization for use. He had been unable to locate any documentation approving its removal from the secure storage, and palace policy required that it be returned immediately. Laura's reaction was swift and explosive. Her face flushed with anger as she processed what she clearly viewed as an unprecedented insult. In a voice that carried farther than she likely intended, she demanded to know how a mere guard dared to question her choice of jewelry. She was family, she declared, and had every right to wear pieces from the collection, especially for such a significant family celebration. The confrontation quickly escalated beyond James's ability to contain it. Laura's raised voice attracted the attention of nearby guests, who turned to witness the unfolding drama. The elegant atmosphere of the birthday celebration began to crack as whispers spread through the crowd, carrying news of the dispute to every corner of the ballroom. Within minutes, the situation had spiraled completely out of control. Laura, feeling publicly humiliated by what she saw as an attack on her status within the family, refused to back down. She declared loudly that she would not be treated like a common thief by the hired help, and that her mother would hear about this outrageous treatment immediately. Queen Camilla, initially unaware of the developing crisis, was quickly informed by her personal secretary about the disturbance involving her daughter. The queen's face went pale as she absorbed the details of the situation. She found herself caught between defending her daughter's dignity and maintaining the protocols that governed the royal collection. The birthday celebration, which had been proceeding with elegant perfection just moments before, ground to an uncomfortable halt. Guests exchanged worried glances as the confrontation between Laura and James became the center of attention. The carefully orchestrated evening was collapsing into chaos, with the Queen's own birthday being overshadowed by a family crisis. James, despite following his orders precisely, found himself in an impossible position. He had acted on direct instructions from his superiors, but now faced the fury of a woman who saw his intervention as a personal attack on her family status. The other guards watched nervously from their positions, understanding that their colleague was facing a situation that could end his career. Prince William and Catherine, who had arrived earlier in the evening, observed the unfolding drama with growing concern. William, in particular, seemed deeply troubled by seeing his stepmother's daughter wearing a piece so closely associated with his mother's memory. The tension in his jaw and the protective way he moved closer to Catherine suggested that the emotional significance of the moment was not lost on him. As the confrontation continued, Laura made a decision that shocked everyone present. Instead of quietly removing the necklace and resolving the matter privately, she announced that she had permission from her mother to wear any piece she chose from the collection. She claimed that as the daughter of the Queen, she had equal standing with other family members when it came to accessing royal jewelry. This declaration created an even deeper crisis. Queen Camilla, when pressed by her private secretary for clarification, was forced to admit that she had never given explicit permission for Laura to access Diana's collection. The necklace had been taken without proper authorization, putting the Queen in the uncomfortable position of having to either publicly contradict her daughter or acknowledge that palace security had been compromised. James, meanwhile, found himself becoming the focus of Laura's escalating anger. She accused him of overstepping his authority, of treating her with disrespect, and of ruining her mother's birthday celebration. Her voice carried across the ballroom as she demanded that he be dismissed immediately for his insubordination. The situation reached a breaking point when Laura, in a moment of pure fury, declared that she would not remove the necklace under any circumstances. She had chosen to wear it as a tribute to Diana's memory, she claimed, and would not allow a security guard to dictate her decisions about family jewelry. The irony of her statement was not lost on those who understood the true significance of the unauthorized taking. Palace communications staff, watching the crisis unfold, began to panic about the potential media implications. Several guests had mobile phones, and the possibility of photos or videos of the confrontation reaching the press was very real. The scandal potential was enormous. Headlines about Diana's jewelry being worn without permission could dominate news cycles for weeks. Captain Reynolds, recognizing that the situation had moved far beyond his ability to control, made the difficult decision to involve higher palace authorities. Phone calls were made to senior royal household officials, legal advisors, and even members of the immediate royal family who were not present at the celebration. The response was swift and decisive. Laura was informed, through official channels, that she must remove the necklace immediately or face formal consequences for violating royal collection protocols. The message was delivered not by James or other security personnel, but by one of the Queen's most senior advisors, making clear that this was not a security matter but a family and legal one. Faced with this official intervention, Laura finally agreed to remove the necklace, but not before making a series of statements that would haunt everyone present. She declared that the treatment she had received was emblematic of how Camilla's children were viewed as second-class family members, despite their mother's position as queen. She suggested that Diana's memory was being used as a weapon against her stepfamily, and that the entire incident was motivated by prejudice against her mother's side of the family. As Laura removed the necklace with shaking hands, the magnificent sapphires caught the light one final time before being secured by palace officials. The silence in the ballroom was deafening as guests processed what they had witnessed. The Queen's birthday celebration had been transformed into a family crisis that exposed deep tensions about status, legacy, and respect within the royal household. James, despite having followed protocol precisely, found himself at the center of a firestorm. Laura's public accusations of overreach and disrespect had created a narrative that painted him as the villain in the situation. Even though he had acted on direct orders from his superiors, he was being portrayed as a guard who had forgotten his place and embarrassed the royal family. The aftermath of the confrontation was swift and brutal. Within hours, James received notice that his employment with the royal household was being terminated, effective immediately. The official reason given was inappropriate handling of a sensitive family matter, but everyone understood that he was being sacrificed to protect the family's reputation and restore harmony. The injustice of his dismissal was not lost on James's colleagues, who knew he had acted with complete professionalism throughout the crisis. But palace politics demanded a scapegoat, and a long-serving guard was expendable in ways that royal family members were not. The message was clear. Loyalty to the crown meant accepting responsibility even when following orders led to uncomfortable consequences. As James packed his personal belongings from his quarters that night, he reflected on the evening's events with a mixture of sadness and growing anger. He had devoted more than 2 decades of his life to protecting the royal family, had maintained their secrets, had stood guard over their most precious possessions and memories, and now he was being dismissed for doing exactly what his training and protocols demanded. The termination letter, delivered in the cold, formal language of palace bureaucracy, made no mention of his years of faithful service or the impossible position he had been placed in. It simply stated that his conduct had been deemed inappropriate and that his services were no longer required. There was no recognition of the difficult circumstances, no acknowledgement of his long record of excellence, no consideration of the fact that he had been following direct orders from his superiors. But James Morrison was not a man to accept injustice quietly, especially when it involved something as precious as Diana's memory. As he walked away from the palace for the final time, a plan was already forming in his mind. If the royal family thought they could silence him with a dismissal, they were about to discover how wrong they were. 3 days after his dismissal, James Morrison sat in his modest flat in South London, staring at the morning newspapers. The royal birthday celebration had been reported as a great success, with glowing coverage of Queen Camilla's elegant gathering and touching family moments. There was no mention of the confrontation, no hint of the crisis that had unfolded behind palace doors, no acknowledgement that a decorated guard had lost his career for protecting Diana's legacy. The silence from the palace was deafening, but James had expected nothing less. Royal scandals were managed with surgical precision, contained within palace walls and buried beneath layers of official discretion. The family's reputation would be protected at all costs, even if it meant sacrificing loyal servants who had dedicated their lives to the crown service. But James had something the palace didn't expect: 23 years of memories, detailed knowledge of royal protocols, and, most importantly, a a complete understanding of what had really happened that night. He had served with distinction through multiple royal crises, had earned the trust of senior staff, and had built relationships with journalists who covered the royal beat. The decision to go public wasn't made lightly. James understood the potential consequences of speaking out against the royal family. His pension could be threatened, his reputation could be destroyed, and he might never work in security again. But as he thought about Diana's memory being dishonored and his own sacrifice being ignored, his resolve hardened. James began by contacting Sarah Mitchell, a respected royal correspondent for the Daily Telegraph, whom he had known professionally for years. Sarah had always been fair in her reporting, focusing on facts rather than sensation, and she understood the complex dynamics within the royal household. When James requested a private meeting, she immediately recognized the significance of a long-serving guard reaching out. The meeting took place in a quiet cafe in Camden, far from the usual haunts of royal watchers and palace staff. James chose his words carefully, explaining the events of that night with the precision that had marked his years of service. He described Laura's unauthorized wearing of Diana's necklace, the confrontation that followed, and his subsequent dismissal for following protocol. Sarah listened with growing amazement as the story unfolded. The unauthorized use of Diana's jewelry was exactly the kind of story that would captivate the public's attention and raise serious questions about how the late princess's legacy was being protected. But she also understood the explosive nature of the allegations and the need for absolute verification. Over the following days, Sarah began her own investigation, contacting sources within the palace and verifying details of James's account. What she discovered corroborated his story in every detail. Multiple sources confirmed that Laura had indeed worn the sapphire necklace without authorization, that a confrontation had occurred during the Queen's birthday celebration, and that James had been dismissed immediately afterward. The story that emerged painted a picture of palace dysfunction that went far beyond a simple jewelry dispute. It revealed tensions between Camilla's children and the broader royal family, questions about access to Diana's collection, and the willingness to sacrifice loyal staff to protect royal reputations. The dismissal of a decorated guard for following orders raised uncomfortable questions about justice and loyalty within the monarchy. As Sarah prepared her article, word began to leak within media circles that a major royal story was developing. Other journalists started making their own inquiries, and palace communications staff found themselves fielding increasingly specific questions about jewelry protocols and staff changes. The careful silence that had initially contained the story was beginning to crack. The palace's response was swift but clumsy. Rather than addressing the substance of the emerging story, they attempted to discredit James's account by questioning his motivations and suggesting that he was a disgruntled former employee seeking attention. They emphasized his dismissal for inappropriate conduct, while refusing to provide specific details about what that conduct had entailed. This strategy backfired spectacularly. James's long record of excellent service was well documented, and his colleagues were willing to speak on his behalf. Captain Reynolds, despite pressure from superiors, confirmed that James had been following direct orders throughout the incident. Other guards described him as professional, dedicated, and unfailingly loyal to the royal family. The contrast between the palace's vague accusations and the specific, detailed account provided by James created a credibility gap that the royal communications team couldn't bridge. When pressed for details about his alleged misconduct, they could only point to his involvement in an inappropriate confrontation with a family member, which actually supported his version of events. Meanwhile, James continued to speak with carefully selected journalists, providing additional context about palace security protocols and the significance of Diana's jewelry collection. He explained how the late princess's pieces were supposed to be held in trust for future generations, how access was strictly controlled, and why the unauthorized use of such significant items represented a serious breach of protocol. Public reaction to the emerging story was immediate and intense. Diana remained beloved by the British public nearly 3 decades after her death, and any perceived disrespect to her memory touched a raw nerve. Social media exploded with outrage over the unauthorized use of her jewelry, and hashtags like Justice for James and Protect Diana's Legacy began trending across platforms. The story took on additional dimensions as royal experts and former palace staff began commenting publicly. They confirmed James's account of how Diana's collection was supposed to be managed and expressed shock that such protocols could be violated so casually. The incident was portrayed as symptomatic of broader problems with how Camilla's family was integrating into royal life. As media coverage intensified, new details emerged that made the situation even more embarrassing for the palace. It was revealed that the sapphire necklace was one of the pieces specifically mentioned in Diana's will as being held in trust for her son's future wives. The fact that it had been worn by Laura, who had no such designation, made the unauthorized use even more problematic. The palace found itself fighting a losing battle on multiple fronts. They couldn't deny that Laura had worn the necklace, because too many guests had seen it. They couldn't justify James's dismissal without admitting that he had been punished for following proper protocols. And they couldn't explain why unauthorized access to Diana's collection had been allowed without raising questions about their stewardship of her legacy. Under mounting pressure, senior palace officials made the decision to quietly reach out to James through intermediaries. They suggested that his dismissal might have been hasty and that there could be opportunities for reconsideration if he were willing to sign a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement. The offer came with implicit threats about the consequences of continued public statements. James's response was swift and unambiguous. He had no interest in returning to work for an institution that had betrayed his loyalty and sacrificed his career to protect a family member who had violated clear protocols. More importantly, he felt a responsibility to continue speaking out about what he saw as a systematic disrespect for Diana's memory and the principles she had represented. The story reached its climax when Prince William, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, made an unexpected public statement. While carefully avoiding direct criticism of his stepfamily, he emphasized the importance of properly managing his mother's legacy and ensuring that her jewelry collection was treated with appropriate respect. The statement was diplomatically worded, but its meaning was clear to anyone following the controversy. Catherine, Duchess of Cambridge, added her own subtle commentary by prominently wearing one of Diana's bracelets to her next public appearance. The choice was seen as a pointed reminder of the proper chain of custody for Diana's jewelry and a silent rebuke to those who would treat the collection casually. The pressure finally forced Queen Camilla to address the situation personally. In a carefully crafted statement, she expressed regret for the misunderstanding that had occurred during her birthday celebration and announced new protocols for managing Diana's collection. She stopped short of apologizing directly, but acknowledged that mistakes had been made and that proper procedures needed to be followed more rigorously. Laura, meanwhile, remained largely silent throughout the controversy, making only a brief statement through her representatives expressing regret for any confusion and emphasizing her respect for Diana's memory. The statement notably avoided any apology for wearing the necklace or any acknowledgement that she had acted improperly. The most significant outcome of the entire episode was the announcement of James's vindication. Under intense public pressure and faced with overwhelming evidence that he had acted properly throughout the incident, the palace formally withdrew his dismissal and issued a public statement acknowledging his exemplary service record. They offered him full reinstatement with back pay and benefits. But James had moved beyond simply seeking personal vindication. He announced his intention to establish a foundation dedicated to protecting the legacy of public servants who found themselves caught between loyalty and principle. The foundation would provide legal and financial support to whistleblowers who exposed wrongdoing in public institutions, particularly those involving the misuse of public trust. The incident also led to significant changes in how Diana's collection was managed. New oversight procedures were established, involving multiple approvals for any access to significant pieces. An independent board was created to monitor the collection and ensure that it was being handled according to Diana's wishes and the public's expectations. Perhaps most importantly, the controversy sparked a broader conversation about accountability within the monarchy. The public's reaction made clear that there were limits to what would be tolerated in terms of self-dealing and disrespect for cherished figures like Diana. The royal family's reputation for being above criticism had been damaged, and they would need to be more careful about how they conducted themselves in the future. For James Morrison, the experience had been both painful and ultimately redemptive. He had lost a career he loved, but gained something more valuable, the knowledge that he had stood up for what was right, regardless of the personal cost. His willingness to speak truth to power had not only vindicated his own actions, but had helped ensure that Diana's memory would be protected for future generations. The sapphire necklace that had sparked the entire controversy was quietly returned to the secure collection where it belonged. It would eventually be worn by Catherine and other future queens, as Diana had intended, rather than being treated as a casual accessory for family celebrations. The principle that some things were too precious to be compromised had been upheld, thanks to the courage of one guard who refused to stay silent when faced with injustice. The story became a reminder that even in institutions as powerful as the monarchy, accountability mattered. The public's trust was not unlimited, and those entrusted with protecting national treasures and cherished memories had a responsibility that transcended personal relationships and family loyalties. James Morrison had honored that responsibility, and, in doing so, had honored both his oath of service and the memory of the people's princess whose legacy he had fought to protect.